Hello everybody. For those of you who don't know me, or any of my work, I'm grounded. I'm very much grounded in. I come from a marketing background as opposed from a politics background. So I'm particularly consumer behaviour, and so when it comes to research in this area, I'm really interested in the way that voters. I'm interested in voter engagement, and voter engagement with brands, and why voters choose one political brand over another. And I thought I'd focus something that's really been interesting to me, or topics that I've sort of been reading about, has been going back to the 2019 election and the almost counterintuitive way that people have been voting. And in particular, the fall of Labour's Red Wall. Now, if you're not sure, or if you haven't heard that term, the Red Wall are a number of constituencies, a number of seats in the UK, in and around the North and the West Midlands that have been traditionally Labour seats. Now, yeah, in any election, marginals do fall, but these were quite unusual seats to fall, because seats like Bolsover had been Labour since it was created in 1950. Burnley, for more than a century, had been Labour, and these suddenly had moved over towards they became Conservative seats in that election. And so what I was really interested in was, the extent to which the models that we currently use, or we are using to explain voter behaviour, the extent to which they're now fit for purpose. Because, say, we were talking earlier in the sort of the warm-up session about the fact that Jennifer and I have known each other for about 100 years now. And when I first started looking into applying marketing concepts to politics and seeing the extent to which they applied, I looked at models of voter behaviour, and there were two primary sort of schools of thinking in terms of either those grounded in social identity, like the party identification model, or the ones very much grounded in sort of rational choice models. And those used to apply, the party identification model, where people had long-term effective affinities with a particular model, with a particular party. This used to, people used to be born and bred Labour, and clearly this doesn't necessarily apply again. And rational choice, that these constituencies have higher levels of unemployment, higher levels of issues with health, so they rely on benefits. They rely on the NHS much more heavily than other areas of the country, and yet these voters were voting for a party that had advocated austerity and continued to advocate austerity, which could positively hurt them. So that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily wasn't necessarily a rational choice. So those models sort of, we look at those and we think, well, what's changed? And obviously the B word comes into play, Brexit. And this has materially affected the way that, or appears to have materially affected the way that people have voted. So sort of looking at other models as well. And I think it brought into play two other models of voting. And they're quite old, those models. There's Budge and Farley's 1983 saliency model. And then there's the directional theory model, which is Rabinowitz and McDonald. So I was looking, I looked at those, and those do actually have some application. So I was thinking, the saliency model is where suggests that voters will have a preference for political brands that really draw attention to the issues that are of most importance to the voter. So this, Boris's Get Brexit Done really stood out compared to Labour's relatively unclear position on Brexit, and of course the Lib Dems' totally anti-Brexit position. So for this particular group, that possibly has an effect. And then, of course, directional theory brings in intensity. So, you know, the more forcefully a political party espouses their position, directional theory suggests this is where, you know, those parties are most successful. But and this also has salience because it also explains the potential growth of some of the more extreme parties, and some of the far right groups have raised their rather nasty heads. Things like Sonnecrieg Division and Assistance Resistance Network, which is an alias of National Action. And again, it also explains why Labour failed, because their position of constructive ambiguity meant that they lacked any intensity at all. But so those two came into play, but there are still gaps. There are still areas that really aren't explained. And certainly my own research and anecdotally what we've seen elsewhere is that people weren't necessarily voting in these seats for the Conservative Party. They may have liked Boris, you know, this cult of personality. A lot of what people said when they were interviewed on the streets that they just didn't like Jeremy Corbyn. So it was a negative vote. Was it a protest vote? It's very difficult to say. You know, Diane Dean and I did some work on negative brands and the fact that they positioned themselves not for what they stood for, but what they stood against, what they weren't. And it appeared that people were voting in a lot of cases, not necessarily for what they were what they wanted, but what they didn't. So there's this gap in the literature between negative voting and protest voting. There seems to be something missing there. And we also, as I mentioned about Boris and the personalized, you know, his cult of personality, there is a degree of, you know, personal branding and an issue around personal branding, and that also comes into play in terms of the personalization of politics and the extent to which who people are and their likability comes into play as well. But overall, when it comes down to it, I do wonder whether increasingly it's down to issue competence and the extent to which people, whether you like what they stand for, or whether you want, you know, you don't know what they stand for, but you are just looking for somebody to vote for, issue competence and the extent to which actually whatever job they do, they are likely to do it well comes into play. And ultimately, whether people are simply voting for the best of a bad bunch. So I put it out to you, are we simply now, have we got to the point where we are our voters are simply voting for the best of a bad bunch?